Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club. My name is Radiance Chapman, and on behalf of Jackson Square Partners, I'm pleased to introduce today's program. Jackson Square Partners is a longtime supporter of the Commonwealth Club and its civic mission to bring people together to discuss and debate the most important ideas and issues facing our world. I'm so pleased that the club is continuing its full slate of in-person programming at its beautiful building in San Francisco, while also continuing to build out its digital efforts, like today's all-virtual program. To learn more about the club's upcoming programs, view past programs, and learn how to become a member, visit the club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Today's program focuses on a new book by our featured speaker, Rana Foroohar, a Financial Times columnist and CNN global economic analyst. Her book, Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World, offers a deep look at the vulnerabilities of globalization and the impact of increased inequality, persistent economic insecurity, and distrust in our institutions as we all face an uncertain future. Before turning it over to our moderator, Kirk Hansen, a longtime friend of the club, a quick note to everyone watching. If you have any questions for our speaker today, please put them in the YouTube chat box. All questions will be shared with Kirk during the discussion portion of the program. Again, Jackson Square Partners is pleased to support this program, and I'm pleased that those who pre-registered will receive a copy of Rana's important new book, courtesy of Ken Broad, one of Jackson Square's founding partners and a longtime supporter of the Commonwealth Club. With that, I turn the program over to Kirk Hansen, Senior Fellow and former Executive Director of the Marcellus Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. He is also a member of the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley Advisory Council. Kirk?
Thank you, Radiance, and hello, everyone. I'm Kirk Hansen. I'm pleased to moderate today's program with Rana Foroohar. Rana, welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our plan is that I'll be in conversation with you for about 45 minutes, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes to ask the questions that our members have raised and using the chat. So hopefully they will use that effectively, and I can ask a series of their questions at the end. But let me start. Your book is a fairly challenging one. You state succinctly at the end of the first chapter what I took to be the theme. You say the bottom line is that the era of globalization as we know it, as we have known it for the last half century, is over. To understand your argument, you then go on to talk about neoliberalism as a predecessor or perhaps a frame in which globalization has arisen. Let's unpack both of those terms, neoliberalism and globalization. Start with neoliberalism. What really is it in your view?
So thank you again for the opportunity. Looking forward to this conversation. Let me unpack neoliberalism to start. The word is used in a lot of different ways in both the US and Europe, but the way that I'm using it, I'm basically taking the IMF's definition, the International Monetary Fund, and they look at it as an economic philosophy, a sort of a political economy philosophy, in which the assumption is that capital, goods, and people can go wherever they want across borders freely, and that crucially, they're going to land where it's most productive for them to be. And this has really been the underpinning philosophy of globalization for the last half century. I should say also that, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's been many waves of globalization over the eons, right? So when we say globalization, lots of different ways to think about it, but I'm talking about the sort of unfettered markets, neoliberal Chicago school philosophy that allowed particularly capital to travel across borders freely and goods to a certain extent over the last half century. Labor, a little less so. And that's one of the problems that I try and get at in my book. One of the flaws in the neoliberal philosophy, and this is something that the IMF itself has actually started writing about, is that the assumption that each of those things, capital, goods, and people, could all travel just as fast and on equal terms was incorrect. And that's why we've gotten a lot of wealth created at a global level because capital has traveled really, 35,000 feet over the problems of the nation state. You see the wealth of multinationals, asset holders in multinational companies, the Chinese state, which is part of the cheap capital, cheap labor bargain that we can get into. But within countries, there's been growing inequality. And that's true not just in the US, but in many other places. And so that's really the crux of the matter that I'm trying to get at in this book.
Okay. And you say that our embrace of neoliberalism in the United States or perhaps globally has never been absolute. You say that we recognize that the individual hand of economics always needed the visible hand of the law. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I was fascinated by is to kind of trace the history of neoliberalism. And a lot of times when folks talk about it in the media, they tend to speak about the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, for example, and the unleashing of global capital. But really, when you go back to the original neoliberal theories, you have to go back to the 1930s, to Europe, the period in between the Great Wars. And there were a lot of philosophers, political scientists, economists that were coming together and trying to figure out how can we tampen down nationalism? How can we tampen down fascism? How can we prevent Europe from going to war and tearing itself apart again? And the way that they figured out to do this was to connect business and in particular capital across borders. And that worked for a long time. This was really the foundation and the influence of many of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, excuse me, the GATT, which eventually became the WTO. But pendulums shift. And sometimes a philosophy works until it doesn't. And I'm arguing that we have these institutions that were, in essence, regulating the political economy in their own way. They worked until they didn't. The pendulum has now gone too far, and we need other kinds of institutions and other kinds of incentives and nudges to make sure that we don't end up back in a similar period. And I argue in the book that one of the problems with globalization and neoliberal globalization as we've known it is that it has increased inequality so much that you've seen populism and nationalism and even fascism return as a result of that. So in a way, we're kind of at that final pendulum shift, in my view, where the political philosophy itself is tapped out.
Who do you consider to be the champions of neoliberalism today? You talk about Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who in the Stanford context, when I was a faculty member at Stanford, I got to debate Milton a couple of times. Besides discovering that he was a more formidable debater than one might ever expect, I found his arguments very persuasive as far as they went. But your critique is basically what people have been saying to Friedman. But who carries that flag today?
It's a good question. I think that the neoliberal philosophy has become so embedded in how our economy works that it's hard to find someone who doesn't carry the flag. Yeah. That's part of the issue. So again, go back to the 80s, to the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. You saw the unleashing of global capital. You saw financial deregulation and companies starting to go abroad. But it wasn't really till the 1990s when you saw the unleashing of trade. And that really happened under the Clinton administration. That's when you saw deals like NAFTA, ultimately the entry of China into the WTO in 2001 being sort of orchestrated. And so one of the points that I get at in the book is that both parties have become beholden to these philosophies. And I actually believe that that's one reason that the Democratic Party lost some working class voters, particularly in swing states, because I think that there's a sense that, is this party looking after me, or is it looking after a group of, sorry to say, but coastal elites? I'm sure one of them, many of the people listening are. I'm sitting here in New York and writing for the FT. But is the party really looking after my interests? Mm-hmm. And I think that sense of the global economy flying so far ahead of national politics is one of the reasons that we're seeing that pull, particularly for the Democrats.
Mm-hmm. So let's unpack further some of the effects that you describe. If globalization is this free flow of capital and supposed labor, although you challenge that clearly. The impacts, inequality was the major one that you argue in the book, and you describe that. You have a number of others. What other 2 or 3 effects do you think are most obvious and, in essence, damaging to the public welfare?
So, the idea that markets are always efficient and always right is very much a Friedman-esque philosophy. And Friedman, of course, was influenced by Hayek. And I think that at this point, in the wake of the financial crisis, the pandemic, war in Ukraine, we're beginning to see that there is such a thing as political in a political economy, and that markets are not operating in some sort of perfect vacuum, that they're influenced by flawed people, by flawed institutions, by behaviors that are not always rational. And that's something that I think has become a real felt experience for everyone, really, in the last few years. So I would say debunking that myth of efficiency is one. I think also the sense that we didn't really have a national conversation in this country about the economic decisions that we were making. And I'd like to share actually an anecdote that I have towards the beginning of the book. It was a conversation that was very seminal, in fact, to the shaping of this book. I was talking to the late labor leader, Richard Trumka, who was the former president of the AFL-CIO. This was several years ago. And I was asking him, what was the conversation around trade policy in the 1990s? And he told me that an administration official from the Clinton administration had come to him, and at the time of NAFTA, and when there was conversation about China into the WTO, and he said, you know that these deals are going to really hurt U.S. labor. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to get through? And the official said, we know, definitely, wages are going to go down. It's going to be tough, but then they're going to go back up. Mm-hmm. And Trumka said, well, how long is that going to take? And the official said 3 to 5 generations. Mm-hmm. And that message that we had policies that were going to result in the hollowing out of communities for 100 years, basically, and that wasn't front and center and really focused on, is, I think, again, one of the reasons why we have such polarized politics today. So that would be another thing that I would point out.
So where was that felt most completely? Family farms, is that agribusiness taking over, global agribusiness taking over the production of food? Is that one of your major examples then?
Food is certainly one of the lenses that I look at. My book is actually, I lay out my thesis in the beginning, and then I look at the effects through the window of 3 different industries: agriculture, textiles, and technology. And we can talk about why I picked those. But in terms of, the breadth of that felt experience, I think it felt throughout U.S. business. My first book, Makers and Takers, explored why companies are so often incentivized to make such short-term decisions that are not always in their best interest. And it's because the financial markets are pushing them to that kind of short-termism. And that means getting, your costs off your balance sheet, outsourcing, replacing as much labor as possible with technology. We don't have a lot of social safety nets or a particularly collaborative labor corporate management movement in this country. So that results in a lot of people getting left behind. And I grew up in rural Indiana, where that was the story of the 1980s and 1990s. Certainly you saw the death of family farms and the growth of agribusiness, which is so hard.
Can you explain that dynamic? How does globalization affect the family farm in the United States?
Well, globalization basically sorts for big, it sorts for cheap, it sorts for consolidation. So, you look at the rise of large multinational companies of every kind, and you can see that playing out. And one of the things that we came to see during COVID, of course, when the pandemic hit, suddenly restaurants are closed, but they're a line at grocery stores and you can't get what you want. Well, why is that? Because there's 2 totally separate supply chains, both optimized for efficiency. And I kind of put that in quotation marks, which means optimized for, very speedy, very concentrated, but they don't talk to one another. They're not resilient. They're not particularly nimble. And you find out that you've got about 4 major food companies controlling the entire system. So that's one of the aspects that you can see this neoliberal philosophy playing out. And it comes with costs. One of the things I try to get at in the book is that cheap isn't always cheap when you look at the secondary effects. Cheap may look great on a balance sheet in a corner office somewhere. But if you look at something like the environmental degradation that comes from big agribusiness, or the health effects of growing, so many cash crops that are actually not nutritious, they may produce a lot of calories, but they're used, like corn, for example, mainly to feed beef or cattle, which is extremely difficult for the environment, or in byproducts that are put into processed foods. This then has a knock-on effect for our healthcare system. So when you start to factor in all those things, and I'm not even counting the price of transport of cash crops and the carbon impact, you get a different calculation.
So why isn't that factored into market price? The multinational executive, if he or she is operating rationally, should be making decisions that take into account all of those costs. And you're saying those are not in the market today?
Well, if you think about how the C-suite is compensated, the average CEO in America gets between 30 and 80% of their compensation in stock. Unfortunately, the things that create long-term value and the things that jack up a share price quarter by quarter are sometimes not the same thing. So the incentives, I think, are a little bit out of whack. And just to shift to a slightly different part of the book, I think you can really see that in the relationship between the U.S. and China, and the business relationship in particular. I've been going to China for 25 years, and I've always thought, first of all, amazing country, incredible people, incredible entrepreneurship and just sort of zeal, energy. But the first time I went, I looked around and I thought, gosh, why do people think that this country is going to seamlessly incorporate itself into the Washington Consensus? That's working for China right now, but eventually this is a country that to me looks very similar to the US in the post-World War II period, where you're going to have a single language market, a lot of room to grow. You're going to want to own more of that market. It's an autocracy. There's no, the state and capitalism are the same. So why would a multinational executive assume that he or she wouldn't be, potentially open to the rules of the game being changed at any moment? Well, that's been a kind of a willful blindness on the part, I think, of executives and policymakers. Now the rules of the game have changed, and you can really see that ripple effect. But these facts were always there, hiding in plain sight.
Mm-hmm. And I have to confess my complicity in that. I used to run an institute within an institute. It was the Beijing-based WTO Institute when China was gearing up to join the WTO. And I headed an institute on business ethics and trying to help Chinese officials think about what the expectations of them were going to be globally. I guess you would argue that the expectations have not been what I might have discussed then in climate or labor relations or whatever, have not been a part of the, if you like, the ethics code of multinationals nor of Chinese companies.
Well, I think that multinational companies are basically incentivized to increase share prices. And, doing that is not always in line with the values, I think, that you're espousing. I mean, one of the great examples of this, I actually had it in my first book, was if you remember the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh, and I believe it was 2011. That's a perfect example of, all right, get costs off the balance sheet. And then it goes from outsourcer to outsourcer to outsourcer. And pretty soon you have a factory in Bangladesh made with shoddy standards that collapses and kills 1,100 people. It was making clothing for big brands like H&M, Walmart, but there was no understanding of that risk because the executive isn't being incentivized to, take care of people way down the line. In Bangladesh, he's being incentivized to keep his share prices up. And that tends to mean keeping, marshaling your capital and getting costs off the balance sheet. In terms of China, I think it's complicated. China has a system that for many years has worked well for China. And I think it's always been a very different political economy than the US, than many parts of Europe. I think we're beginning to see just how different now. Xi Jinping's regime, of course, which is really hardening state control is adding another layer to that difference, I think. But even before that, those differences were there.
Mm-hmm. Before we go on, let me remind our viewers that we're speaking with Rana Foroohar, who's a global business columnist and associate editor of the Financial Times and author of the new book, Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Rana, let's continue our look at the evidence that globalization is failing us. You point to a variety of other indicators, including the financial meltdown, the fragility of finance 2008, and others. Do you think these will continue to pile up, these failures, if we continue to rely on globalization?
I think that they will. I mean, in some ways, the problems of liquidity that, were so evident in the 2008 crisis and which was really, it was a financial crisis. Those problems are now evidenced in supply chains, in inventory. I mean, inventory and liquidity have become kind of similar in terms of the paradigms you might look at for comparing 2008 to today. We have discovered over the last few years how much it matters if you get your energy from an autocrat, how much it matters if you source PPE from the lowest cost producer, in this case, China, which then decides in the middle of a pandemic, we'd like to keep that for our own people, which makes sense from Beijing's perspective, but of course presents challenges for the US. Those things are only going to increase. I was speaking as part of my book, but also recently to a supply chain expert that was making the point to me that in the case of war in Ukraine, there were maybe 5 crucial supply chains that were, really compromised as part of that war. If we were to see a blockade of Taiwan, let's say, which is not out of the question, there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of supply chains that would be impacted. Now, you can see in the US that the Biden administration has started really taking some pathways, sketching out some pathways about what matters. Rare earth minerals matter. Semiconductors matter, lithium batteries matter, but within just those 3 baskets, and I wouldn't even say that those are the limit of what the core baskets should be. You could look at pharmaceuticals, many other things. There are hundreds of thousands of inputs, and companies don't know where all of them are. Government, not one agency, a single agency of government doesn't know all that. That's all being figured out at the moment, and so I think we are going to see dominoes continue to fall. And, you can see even just in the last, week or so, that the semiconductor supply chain has changed dramatically.
We're backing off the reliance on Taiwan for 92% of our general chips and so on. Is this a whole new era of supply chain? I saw in one of your other interviews, you're talking about the rule of 4 and having multiple sources for almost anything that you desperately need. Is that where we're headed? Is that political instability is going to lead to a multinational executive would say greater costs in the supply chain? We might talk about resilience as a more positive concept, but is that where we're headed?
Well, in an answer, yes. And both things are true, right? Resiliency and potentially higher inflation. Resiliency has a cost. It's that whole cheap wasn't really as cheap as we thought argument. When you tally in the input costs of high quality labor, environmental standards, energy. And of course, as you and many of the listeners will probably know, some of those calculations were changing even before the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So, I can remember talking to executives 5, even 10 years ago that were saying, wages in China have gone up enough and energy costs and emissions are high enough that we're going to rethink the idea of taking really low margin products through long supply chains to the South China Seas. That's something that was already being thought about. The rise of high-tech additive manufacturing, which is an amazing, amazing opportunity, I think, for this country and for many, was changing the ability to hub production and consumption, which of course has a lot of advantages for companies. So this was already happening. Now you layer on the geopolitical aspect of it and the sense of, in a pandemic, what do you want to have? What's important to you? I think that it's only going to speed up.
Mm-hmm. Um, the Can you characterize the new consensus that's emerging? If we reject what Friedman called the flat Earth, the world is flat,
Yeah.
and I love that you're challenging that popular notion. What do we describe this new consensus as? What is it?
So it's a really good question. We're still developing it. We don't have a unified field theory yet. Mm-hmm. And, that's challenging, right? Because when you have a unified field theory, when you have the world is flat thesis, mm-hmm. the neoliberal thesis, markets are always efficient. That's it. We're done here. Nothing to see. Mm-hmm. It's kind of easy. But when you start to think about the messy real world that we live in, it gets more complicated. So, there are the beginnings of theories about where we could be going. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has talked about a modern supply side in which mm-hmm. the government has to take a little bit more active role in the production and supply side of the equation for the economy because the market's not doing it. And masks would be a great example of this. I'll share a story actually from the book. One of the areas I looked at quite carefully was the textile supply chain in North and South Carolina. And I looked at that because I wanted an example of what was the industry that was hardest hit by China into the WTO. And you could probably say that either textiles or furniture would be that. Mm-hmm. So the pandemic hits. We're all buying these 3-cent masks from China. Suddenly they're not available. You have all these companies in the supply chain in the Carolinas, and the companies that are left are sort of Darwinian case studies of how to run a really, really efficient business. They tend to be middle market, private, so they don't face Wall Street pressure as much. Uh-huh. Often they're community-based, so they know the lay of the land. They're both collaborating and competing with folks in their region. Uh-huh. So very nimble, almost like a Stuttgart model, a kind of a Germanic model of how to do business. And they say, okay, nobody's buying t-shirts, so let's try and make masks. Well, at that point, the average cost to make an American mask was 30 cents. By the time the pandemic was over, it was 10 cents. That's pretty good. That's pretty efficient. That shows you that you can still make things. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe as a country, we should come in and put a floor under that market and say, let's get 25% of our supply and maybe use federal or state purchasing budgets to do that of masks from this particular industry. And then let's think about how that industry, which was so nimble and able to turn, might also be able to turn to make, say, covers for wind turbines or upholstery for electric vehicles. That's the kind of modern supply side push. Now, it also starts to veer into industrial policy. I'll use a third rail term, or strategy, as Brian Deese would say. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. But I do think that sense of sometimes the markets are not allocating effectively when it comes to those common goods is something we have to start paying attention to. I mean, we do it with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, right? Which has certainly come in handy recently.
And there may be, as you say, a strategic reserve in chips, a strategic reserve in,
that's right,
in other areas. So does that mean, take tariffs as another expression, perhaps, of industrial policy? Do you see a much more aggressive tariff strategy by the United States to limit that dependence on particular countries, perhaps for supply?
Well, so it's an interesting question. I was unusual amongst my colleagues at the FT, I would say, in being sympathetic towards the tack that Bob Lighthizer, the former Trump USTR, took around tariffs, because, having, again, studied the market, the US-China relationship, I did feel for some time that it was out of balance and unfair. And so I do think that tariffs have a role to play in this. But I think there need to be both carrots and sticks, right? Otherwise, you don't want to get into a trade war, a tit for tat tariff war. But if you look at, say, the Inflation Reduction Act, the new, which is essentially a climate policy, right, that the Biden administration has passed, as the math gets done on how sourcing happens and who gets to, be part of that incentivization program, there'll be border adjustment issues. There'll be some countries that are doing the right thing with carbon, will be able to come in more cheaply than countries that are doing the wrong thing with carbon. And so, and conversely, American companies that have been in some ways disadvantaged in the global marketplace by doing the right thing will be able to be incentivized. That's the ideal way that this would work out for me.
This touches on what's basically a value question of how we approach climate change and change our values and begin to be willing to incur some costs associated with that in the shorter term. Do you see that happening, that the United States will have that capacity? We've become pretty dependent both on cheap prices because of globalization, and even though it produces all of these inequities that you described, we're pretty used to having the low prices that globalization has given us. And we're also pretty skeptical as a polity about climate change and other things that are beyond my lifetime, your lifetime. And so
it's, that's the golden question, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and it's such a profound question. We're really at a pivot moment on that. And I think the next year is going to give us a really good indication about whether the American public is going to be on board with this or not. Now, some of what happens, let's be fair, is out of our control. And often in the US, we talk about these things as though we're the only player in the market. I would actually argue that in some ways, China is the more important driver of what's happening, because if you look years ago, they announced in their 5-year plan that they wanted to have what's called a dual circulation economy. And what that means is we want to keep more production at home. We want to hub production and consumption. We want to own our own supply chains and be much more regional. Mm-hmm. It makes sense for all kinds of reasons. We've talked about some of them: climate, labor, et cetera. So China is moving ahead with that strategy. Mm-hmm. I think it is very unlikely that there's going to be a recoupling of the technological supply chains between China and the US for national security reasons. So in that world, I think regionalization just has to happen. Now, how are we going to deal with the higher costs of that resiliency, and who's going to bear the burden? And that's where you're making this very important point. Americans, particularly lower income Americans, not only have gotten used to lower prices, they depend on them. And so the question is, who's going to pay the price for that resiliency? Is it going to be the consumer, particularly the lower end consumer? Is it going to be companies? Is it going to be the government? My hope, I mean, we'll see what happens in the midterms, but my hope is that there's going to be more burden sharing on the part of corporate America there, and that there's also going to be a stronger public-private partnership working together to sort of figure out how to make sure that low wage Americans don't end up spending, a huge amount of their income, more than they are already, in things like food and fuel and, heating their homes or driving their cars. I think that may be the economic question of the next 5 years.
Let me just focus on your notion about regionalism. So you see regional economic strategies, supply chain strategies emerging, where we might be part of a Canada, Mexico, perhaps South America region, and you have an East Asia region, and maybe you have a Europe region, maybe a Russian region. Is that the future? And that we're going to basically be trying to source as much as we can within our regional
I think that will be the future. In an ideal world, and Deputy Canadian Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland gave a really wonderful speech about this a couple of weeks ago at the Brookings Institution. In an ideal world, this could be like a better NAFTA. You could finally think about labor a little bit, think about income-based growth rather than just, financialized growth, globalized growth, pushing costs off the balance sheet and not worrying about the worker. That hasn't worked. When you look at the idea that cheap goods in Walmart were going to essentially make up for lost jobs, it's just a complete fallacy, because you look at the rising cost of all the things that make us middle class: housing, education, in this country, healthcare. They were rising at triple the core inflation rate even before this latest bout of inflation. And we can talk about some of the reasons for this bout, but that bargain just wasn't working. A cheaper flat screen TV in Walmart was not making up for the fact that we were not growing middle class jobs. And so I think that this new kind of trade regionalism in an ideal world could really help take us to that next level. And one of the things I'm quite optimistic about is the way in which the revolution of the consumer internet is now coming to business, and that poses a tremendous opportunity, because all the things that are so powerful in our phones that we're all holding are now coming to business. And a lot of that IP lives in the US, it lives in Canada. At the same time, there is still a pretty nimble manufacturing base in Mexico and in the US. You could see that kind of regionalism working to grow higher end jobs in which manufacturing and services are more closely knit together, with a layer of technology and data on top that I think could be really terrific if we get it right.
I'm not clear how labor is going to be helped by all of this. How are its wages going to rise, and how are we going to cope? And you point out one other dimension of the labor equation, which is the huge growth of care jobs.
Oh yes,
in the United States.
That's a separate topic. Let me take that in a separate point. But in terms of how labor would benefit, if we get the policies right and we're able to create high quality, made in America or made in America and its allies jobs that actually upskill workers and take the US manufacturing base, knitting it together with IoT, Internet of Things, with services, with data, take that to a more competitive level, you get higher productivity, and then ultimately you're going to get higher wages. Mm-hmm. What we did was essentially outsource the entire industrial base, at least big companies did. And that resulted in a very bifurcated labor force. You got kind of an overhang of the old union system within Detroit, but then you got a lot of cheap labor, but not particularly well skilled coming up in the red states, and a big hollowed out middle. Fortunately, there are still some mid-market family firms in that middle, but I think building up that middle is so important to competitiveness and resiliency, because let's face it, the world isn't flat, it's bumpy, and it's going to get bumpier for a little while.
And you point out education is critical, whether it be skills-based education a la a German model, but the importance of building up that capacity to take advantage of those bumpy opportunities.
For sure. And that kind of plays into the services question as well. You'd raised the point about care jobs becoming so important. That's right. Another tailwind to localization, I would say, because if you look at, say, the top 10 fastest growing job categories, about 6 of them are in the care professions, healthcare, education, et cetera. And those are local. I mean, some of that can be outsourced, but not a whole lot. It's mostly local. And demographics are going to mean that the labor market in those areas is going to become tighter. And so you're going to have a strong labor market for care if you can connect that with education that really makes those jobs great jobs, takes them from being $15 an hour jobs to really high quality ways of providing healthcare to an aging demographic. I think that could be a tremendous opportunity economically.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so let's evaluate how far this revolution that you're describing has come. Sure. Do you think we are partway through this localization, relocalization, or do you think that it's really still primarily in the future? Or and maybe the awareness is there that we've got to make this pivot. How do you assess that?
I would say it's a little farther along than that. If you go back 5-6 years in time, you were already starting to see most cross-border goods trade being flat or falling in many cases. So that goes back to the sense that for a lot of reasons, be it environmental, wage costs, productivity, energy, arbitrage, companies were localizing. They were starting to regionalize and localize. That cheap capital, cheap labor bargain between the US and Asia had been starting to be tapped out in some industries. Add to that the technological advancements. Additive manufacturing is up 22% year on year. You're seeing a lot more localized production now. So goods and services of many kinds, definitely localizing. Data less so. Cross-border data flows are still, that's pretty globalized. But I would argue that as the US, Europe, and China start to go in somewhat different ways in terms of how they regulate, particularly the US and China, how they regulate the internet, and data services in general, I think you're going to see a little more decoupling there. There's a big trade negotiation going on right now, the IPEF negotiation, that's going to essentially pave a new way for the US and Asia. Mm-hmm. And digital is a big part of that. What are our values around data? How are we going to protect it? Do we know we don't want state surveillance capitalism a la China, but we have surveillance in this country too. So what are our values? What are the balances? How should we think about antitrust? These are all the questions that are being asked right now in the digital world.
Mm-hmm. And that raises the question: what will remain global, or more global than more local? And data perhaps is one with some kinds of rules, I guess, from your argument.
I think that's right. But I think traditional goods is definitely going to localize and regionalize. Services will be a mixed bag. It's going to depend on the industry. It's going to depend on the country and the sort of values paradigm, I think. People, that's tricky. It's a double-edged sword. I mean, one of the things that's been quite interesting post-pandemic is to see, all right, there's been this entirely new work map created in the US, right? I mean, we all started working remotely. Many of us, moved or relocated 2 or 3 hours outside of cities, maybe further. And it's interesting. I was talking at a CEO conference to some folks about this about a year ago. Mm-hmm. And they said, yeah, on the one hand, that argues for kind of new localized wealth creation in the US. You see cities like Austin or Charlotte really taking off. People go to Tahoe. Mm-hmm. But he said, if you can do the job in Tahoe, you can do it in Bangalore. And so that starts to raise the question, are we going to see white collar job outsourcing? And I suspect that will be a very contentious area of debate in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at what the impacts are going to be like in those small towns and in the cities of the United States going forward. I was interested in your love of the Indiana small town and the sense that those are some of the areas that have been hit hardest by globalization. Will this mid-market development you talk about, will that reinvigorate small towns or a selection of small towns, do you think?
I do. I can see that happening in certain parts of the Midwest, of the, what would have been called the Rust Belt, and certain parts of the South. You can certainly see it in the Carolinas with the EV, in South Carolina in particular, with the EV incentives there. In Indiana, where I grew up, there is an interesting rebound, and some of it, fascinatingly, is being driven by overseas corporations. You get a company, an Indian tech company coming in and saying, hey, there's a pretty good mix of, reasonably low cost housing, relatively skilled labor, because there's still some strong state universities in this area. We'll come in, we'll bolster these parts of the country. But I think also this idea that we are going to make things again, that is going to support the Rust Belt in general. You can see that with the announcement of the big fab, semiconductor fab in Ohio, and now another one in upstate New York. Mm-hmm. So I expect there's going to be more of that.
Will it occur quickly enough, perhaps, to nip in the bud this reaction of the neglected small towns politically and their rebellion against the elites?
It is such a great question. I was literally in Washington having that conversation with a policymaker in the administration. And I am a little worried because it does take time for these things to play out. I mean, as everyone in your audience probably knows, semiconductor fabs take really 10 years to kind of ramp up, build, have all that productivity trickle through. Right. I think it's going to be till 2024 before we really start to feel, at a grassroots level, some of this change. So I'm not so sure it's going to help in the midterms. Now, is it going to help in the presidentials? Possibly. I do think that Biden's work, not wealth slogan is a powerful one. A lot of people accuse the administration of not doing very good messaging. I don't know. I mean, it's comparing Trump to Biden is a little apples to oranges. So we'll have to see who the Republicans put up.
What about the cities? I'm personally very interested in the future of the cities. I at one point was deputy director of a group in Chicago that tried to refurbish and encourage the development, economic development in the central city. It sounds in your book as if you think the city centers will be dispersed to multiple places around the city that will have in different boroughs or in different parts of cities economic development, but not necessarily in the central city and not necessarily led by big multinationals that in the past have been the anchor of our great cities.
Yeah, well, I think, going back to what we spoke about earlier, I think if globalization for the last half century has argued for big and concentrated, I think the whole pendulum shift to a neoliberal model, everything from revitalization of manufacturing to a place-based economics. Within the economics profession, there's a growing sense that, guess what? It kind of does matter whether you grow up in, Palo Alto or Toledo. If you can believe it, in economic models, those things were not accounted for in the past. So that kind of decision making is going to support different regions. In terms of the cities themselves, I've been quite fascinated just to watch what's happened in New York, for example. Pandemic hits, Midtown, which is where all the big office buildings, the big corporate anchor tenants is hollowed out right away. And that, I think, that's going to have a problem coming back. You're probably going to see some shifts in real estate development and multi-use buildings. But areas like mine in Brooklyn or outer boroughs like Queens have been booming. 9 out of the top 10 fastest growing markets since the pandemic have been in Brooklyn or Queens, which are outer boroughs. And that's because the balance is better. You've got, it's still New York, it's not perfect, but you've got a paradigm in which you can afford housing, you can maybe get a job nearby. There's possibly a public school and some transport. Whereas in Midtown Manhattan, you have to be a billionaire to afford an apartment, or a millionaire maybe. There's not a public school there. Everything's hyper concentrated, very bifurcated. I think communities that are less bifurcated and more integrated between public-private, between residential and commercial, between the types of commercial manufacturing, I think that the types of commercial activity, I think those are going to take off. And it's very Jane Jacobs way of looking at the world. I think it's coming back.
But it's not coming back to the old model where you had a few large multinationals headquartered in the downtown.
I don't think so, because nobody's able to get people back 5 days a week.
Right. What impact will all of this have on our global political relationships with China and Russia and so on? What do you see? Political economy, all relations with China are both political and economic.
It's a great question, and it's something I'm worried about. Look, there's no doubt that the relationship is contentious. I would argue that some of the things that are happening now, for example, the export ban in the last week or so on high-end dual-use chip technology. Okay, you could look at that as an aggressive act. You could say, oh gosh, this is taking us to a more contentious place. You could also look at it and say, you know what, we've all been willfully blind to the fact that these two systems were not integrating in the way that we thought that they would. And now that scrim has been pulled up and actions are being taken to make sure that we're not vulnerable, no matter what happens. I do think that it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China, which, if you've been watching the news from the last couple of days through the Party Congress, is becoming much more focused on national security than growth, much more hardline. I think that that's going to be a difficult relationship going forward. One thing I am hopeful about is that the transatlantic relationship can be strengthened. And I think that that's where really spelling out, what does friendshoring mean? What does it mean to be part of these new economic unions with big countries like the US? Europe in particular, Britain, I work for a British newspaper, feeling a little anxious right now because they're sort of small countries that are out in the middle of this new great power conflict and they don't know where they're going to fit. It's going to be really important to make people understand that there are coalitions of the willing around values that can be built.
Mm-hmm. Let me get to a couple of questions. Thank you for very interesting and thorough discussion. I want to get to a couple of the questions that the members have raised. The concept of place-based economics, a couple of people have pursued that and said, what does that really mean and how far can it progress? We've gotten to some dimensions of that, but we've talked about place-based strategies in the past. How does it apply to this moment and place-based economics?
So in my book, I have an interview with I had a conversation with an aide to a very high-level Democratic senator, and we were talking about this idea that Democrats in the Clinton administration in particular have, that it didn't matter where you put the jobs, you just had to create the jobs. You know, it's all that the markets are totally efficient and they'll put things wherever they're best placed to do so. So, okay, we created a lot of jobs on the coast. We didn't create any in the towns that ended up voting Trump. You know, that was a problem. And that assumption that the community didn't matter, that place didn't matter, which is now being disproved. You know, in fact, Gordon Hanson, who's a Harvard academic, and his colleague Danny Roderick have a wonderful project on reimagining capitalism that's looking at the really hyper-specific, localized dynamics in these markets. Mm-hmm. And what they're finding is that people in the places that have been the most hollowed out tend to be even less mobile than other people might be, because they are looking for security. They are looking for to keep whatever tenuous threads of community or place can support them. So this idea that we have in the US that everybody's totally mobile and we're all kind of, you know, globetrotters and we can just move from city to city, mm-hmm. not only works less well at a national level than it did, it's particularly ill-suited to economic development in certain parts of the country.
Mm-hmm. There's some questions about the building of fabs in the United States, Intel's new fab, chip fab, and the basic question is, who's going to pay for all this? Is it indeed governments through things like the CHIP Act that are going to end up paying for some of that redundancy and resiliency? Or do we really expect these businesses to pick up, multinational businesses, to pick up the additional cost of that resilience? Or will they run right off the cliff, immolating themselves when we have a war or something that totally disrupts their business model?
Wow, what a great question. One of the reasons I love talking to you all is there's just such smart questions from your listeners. I think a few different things are going to happen. Let me start with just a little bit of historical context. If you look back in the last couple of 100 years at the periods in this country, or really in most of the developed world, where you have real growth, not financialized growth, not the stock market is going up, but real shared growth where GDP goes up, incomes go up, you know, people are feeling prosperous and the economy is dynamic. Those tend to happen around the emergence of a big pivotal technology, the railroads, the internet. Now it's clear to me that that's clean tech and, you know, anything to do with the climate transition. The government comes in and puts a floor under the market, either by incentivizing, you know, the race to the West in the case of the railroads, or, you know, DARPA, the internet, you know, came out and then Silicon Valley commercialized it. You get a floor under a market and then the private sector comes in and commercializes it. Now you need demand. You need demand. And that's where I think it's going to be interesting with chips. It's kind of the great experiment. Can we get enough demand by just the US and allies coming together and saying, yeah, we do need this supply. We are going to underwrite this. In that case, I think that the government's investment, which has been substantial, will pay off. But this cannot be a one-sided, you know, every industry goes to Washington looking for support kind of a thing. Because for one thing, companies are holding the vast majority of wealth right now. I mean, they have the largest share of the overall economic pie in post-war history, roughly. So it's going to be important that they play their role in this too. And, you know, whether that is done willingly or through redistribution, it's going to be an interesting question. But I do think that companies are going to be under more pressure to really invest. And that will be incentivized with, I think, tax credits for productive CapEx. I think you're probably going to see some more rollback and tamping down of share buybacks. And that balance between Wall Street and Main Street and incentivizing the right kind of growth is going to shift.
Mm-hmm. The skepticism of industrial policy has arisen in the questions.
Yes,
And,
sure.
can the government pick the right chip production, or are chips the thing that it ought to invest in, or railroads at the time they were, or DARPA at the time that the internet was generated.
I would love, and tweet me if you're listening, and if you have a great example of what the government should have funded at the time of the railroads or at the time of the internet that is a counterexample, I'd love to hear that, because I think we made pretty good choices. Big transformative technology, encourage it. The private sector goes. I mean, to me, it's just quite clear that that's clean tech right now. You could argue that biotech is in part important too. There are other things, but do I think that the Biden administration is getting it roughly vectorally right by saying we care about rare earth minerals, lithium batteries, and semiconductors? Yeah, I do. Do I think they should get into picking the exact companies? No, I'm not for picking winners. I don't think the government does a great job of that, but I do think that there's an opportunity. I've written a number of columns about this, for the public and private sector to come together and start really tracking, where are our supply chains? Mm-hmm. Where have they gone the last 50 years? I mean, where is stuff? Not that we have to bring it all back or localize it or reshore. We don't want to do that in every case, but we don't even know where the risk is. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is like 2007. And we have no idea who's holding all the subprime bad debt.
Well, it's interesting. We've taught a course at the Stanford Business School for a couple of generations now on strategy in a non-market environment to try to pick up political risk and a variety of other topics. And I'm not sure we've ever had the knowledge base or the data base to develop those strategies.
Well, I honestly think, Stanford, Harvard, MIT, some of these institutions would be, or, organizations, the McKinsey Global Institute would be well served to start digging into this, because every time I'm in Washington, I hear this: we need more data. And I hear this from companies too. I mean, interestingly, I had a conversation recently with the largest yarn maker in America, this company, Parkdale, that basically makes all the cotton swabs that we've all been using, religiously in the last few years. And they don't know what the yarn production is in North America as a whole, because the government defunded the organization within Commerce that's tracked that 20 years ago. That's kind of a nice bit of information to have. Now, maybe the government shouldn't be doing all this, but somebody needs to be holding that information. This is like, a plug to all listeners in public and private sector. There's a market opportunity there.
We got a couple questions about Silicon Valley. We're very self-referential here in Silicon Valley.
You guys do a lot of good stuff. A lot of props to you.
So one is, what would you recommend to Apple, given its exposure to all of its manufacturing in China? And let's start with that, and then I'll give you the other one. What is a company that is terribly exposed to China and other difficult places?
Well, without giving investment advice, I'll just say I'm short big and globalized, and I'm long, mid-sized, smaller, and localized and regionalized. I mean, if you just look at the what small caps have done in the last year compared to the S&P, they're more than double the return, which I think reflects the fact that big companies, in which, Apple's a great example, actually, that make a lot of their money via highly globalized supply chains in parts of the world where it's becoming much more difficult to do business, and particular technology business, tough, very tough. Qualcomm is another great, the consumer brands are one thing, but think about a company like Qualcomm, half its business comes from Apple, half comes from China. Whoa, that's a head spinner. And I'm not sure the markets have reflected that completely yet.
Mm-hmm. And the other question has to do with the formation of businesses and the entrepreneurship of Silicon Valley. If we return to a more place-based economic strategy and more of a localization, what does that do to business formation and entrepreneurship and such in the United States?
Well, I hope that all of these things will essentially spread the wealth. more wealth in place. I mean, my core observation in this book is that creating global wealth is great, but the global economy got so far ahead of local communities and local community well-being that it created not only wild income inequality and a very lopsided economy. You know, it's like you and I are on either coast, kind of like pulling down, and then the rest of the country is someplace else. It created a crisis of democracy because there are a lot of people that feel that the system is rigged against them and isn't working for them. And we've got to fix that. We've got to get a better balance in our economy and thus in our politics.
Can you make that case to business people so that they become part of the, if you like, the lobby for government policies that facilitate that, or even influence their own decisions about, you know, where they're going to source and such?
Well, you know, I think that a lot of business people are kind of getting hip to this. It's funny, you know, I started thinking about this paradigm shift from global to local, or the balance between the two, years ago. And probably 10 years ago, I had an interesting interview. Actually, I was at Time Magazine at that point. I did a cover story on Howard Schultz at Starbucks. And he, like many people that ran consumer-facing brands, were starting to get worried about income inequality and the economic ramifications of that. And I think a lot of consumer brands have felt for a while, gosh, I mean, as he put it to me back then, you know, you have a country of latte makers and latte drinkers, and you better hope if you're making the lattes, you have more drinkers, you know, or you have enough drinkers. Now, I think that a lot of businesses in many fields, because of the supply chain issues, are starting to feel that. And I think a lot of business leaders are voting with their feet. I had a fascinating conversation again in the Carolinas with an industrial sector CEO that said, you know, sometimes we vote Republican, sometimes we vote Democrat, but we always vote on trade because that's where our bread is buttered. And that kind of speaks to these larger policy issues of, you know, is the global economy serving our national interests and our local interests? We have to make sure that those two things are connected.
That presumes that voting on trade means that you might support some constraints on total free trade.
Well, that's also a good point. And I guess it depends on the kind of CEO you're talking about and where they sit.
I'll end with one of the questions here, which is just what are the stakes if we don't respond as a country to some of these changes in both economics and the political sphere?
You know, I think the stakes right now are, do we as Americans, do we want to be a little more like Germany, or do we want to be a little more like Brazil? You know, I mean, I have a strange bifurcated reporting life where I spend about half my life talking to some of the world's wealthiest people, and about half my life talking to the opposite, you know, going out and meeting workers and, you know, all over the country. And I do see us moving into this world where there are havens of wealth, there are hubs of wealth that seem almost to be taking refuge from the national conversation. And that worries me. That worries me a lot. Because that doesn't end well for anyone.
Let me thank you for a very stimulating conversation, and also thank you for a very stimulating book, and the thesis of which we're going to be grappling with for years to come. So our thanks to Rana Foroohar, author of Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Thank you for joining us today. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Rana's book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Kirk Hansen, and I thank Rana Foroohar and you members for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirk. Thanks to everyone listening.